Miriam Watson, a 72-year-old widow, sat by her living room window, her sharp eyes scanning the quiet street of her suburban neighborhood. For years, Maple Street had been a picture of middle-class tranquility, but lately, something was amiss. Night after night, a sleek black car would glide down the street, disappearing into the dilapidated garage at the end of the block. Behind the wheel was James Harlow, a black millionaire who had once been a pillar of the community, now a man shrouded in mystery. Beside him, a young girl in a yellow dress, her eyes holding secrets too heavy for her years. As Miriam watched, her curiosity turned to concern. What could James Harlow, a man known for his wealth and generosity, be doing in an abandoned garage with a little girl night after night? And why did his presence in this unexpected place send ripples of unease through the once peaceful neighborhood? Before we dive into this tale of dark secrets, courage, and unexpected twists, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this video, don't forget to subscribe. The quaint, tree-lined streets of Brookvale buzzed with the gentle hum of suburban life. Neat rows of modest homes stood proudly, their well-manicured lawns a testament to the middle-class aspirations of their owners. It was a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, or at least thought they did. Amidst this tapestry of ordinary lives, a most extraordinary sight had begun to catch the attention of Brookvale's residents. Every evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a sleek black vintage car would glide down Maple Street. Its polished surface reflected the fading light, turning heads and piquing curiosities. Behind the wheel sat James Harlow, a striking figure who seemed almost out of place in this modest setting. In his mid-30s, James exuded an aura of wealth and sophistication that was hard to ignore. His sharp blue suit, always impeccably pressed, spoke of boardrooms and high-stakes business deals rather than the quiet streets of Brookvale. But it wasn't James alone who drew the neighbors' attention. Beside him, her small face barely visible above the dashboard, sat a young girl. Amara, no more than 7 or 8 years old, was a vision in her bright yellow dress, a stark contrast to James's muted elegance. Their destination was always the same, an abandoned garage at the end of Maple Street. The dilapidated structure, with its peeling paint and rusted door, stood in sharp contrast to the well-maintained homes surrounding it. As James's car approached, the garage door would creak open, swallowing the odd pair into its shadowy depths. From her perch by the living room window, Miriam Watson watched this nightly ritual with growing fascination and concern. At 72, Miriam was a fixture of the neighborhood, her watchful eyes missing little that transpired on her street. The widow's days were filled with observing the comings and goings of her neighbors, a pastime that had only intensified since her husband's passing 3 years ago. Miriam's brow furrowed as she watched James's car disappear into the garage once again. The whole affair struck her as decidedly odd. She remembered James from his occasional visits to the neighborhood in years past, a wealthy businessman known for his charitable contributions to struggling families in the area. His mansion in the affluent part of town was legendary, a symbol of success that many in Brookvale could only dream of. So what was he doing here, night after night in this run-down garage, and with a child no less? The questions gnawed at Miriam, keeping her up long after the lights in the garage had gone out. As days turned into weeks, the routine never varied. James and Amara would arrive just before dusk, the girl's yellow dress a bright spot in the gathering gloom. They would vanish into the garage, emerging only as the first light of dawn touched the sky. James, still in his sharp suit, would usher Amara into the car, and they would drive away, leaving behind a wake of whispers and speculation. Miriam found herself spending more and more time by her window, her knitting forgotten in her lap, as she strained to catch a glimpse of the mysterious pair. She noted how James never interacted with anyone in the neighborhood, his face a mask of determined indifference as he guided Amara from car to garage and back again. The girl, for her part, seemed content enough. Her bright dress was always clean and pressed, her hair neatly braided. But there was something in her eyes, a shadow that Miriam couldn't quite place. that stirred a deep unease in the older woman's heart. As summer faded into autumn, Miriam's concern grew. She found herself imagining all sorts of scenarios, each more troubling than the last. Was James hiding something? Was Amara in some kind of danger? The rational part of her mind tried to dismiss these thoughts. After all, James had always been known as a generous and upstanding member of the community. But the nightly visits to the garage, the secrecy, the isolation, it all added up to something that Miriam couldn't ignore. She began to make excuses to be outside when James's car was due to arrive, watering her flowers, checking the mail, or simply taking an evening stroll. Anything to get a closer look. But James was vigilant, his eyes scanning the street as he quickly ushered Amara into the garage. Miriam never managed to get close enough to speak to either of them. As the leaves began to turn, painting Brookvale in shades of red and gold, Miriam's neighbors started to take notice of her increased vigilance. Mrs. Johnson from next door commented on how often she saw Miriam at her window these days. Tom from across the street joked about Miriam taking up bird-watching, but Miriam brushed off their comments with a smile and a wave, unwilling to share her growing concerns. Inside, however, her mind was a whirlwind of questions and theories. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying every detail she had observed over the past months. The way James's hand would protectively guide Amara into the garage. The girl's quiet demeanor, so at odds with most children her age. The stark contrast between their fine clothes and the decrepit building they called home every night. Something was amiss in Brookvale. Miriam was sure of it. And as the nights grew longer and colder, she became equally certain that it was up to her to uncover the truth. Little did she know that her pursuit of answers would lead her down a path that would challenge everything. She thought she knew about her quiet little neighborhood and the people who called it home. The Brookvale Community Center stood at the heart of the neighborhood, a hub of activity where locals gathered to socialize, participate in various programs, and discuss the goings-on of their tight-knit community. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, the center buzzed with the usual energy of the weekly book club meeting, which had just concluded. Miriam sat at one of the circular tables in the main hall, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of chamomile tea. Around her, familiar faces chatted and laughed, the air filled with the comfortable camaraderie of long-time neighbors. But Miriam's mind was elsewhere, still fixated on the mystery that had consumed her thoughts for weeks. As the conversation ebbed and flowed around her, Miriam found herself only half listening to Debbie's animated recounting of her grandson's latest soccer match. Her eyes kept drifting to the large windows overlooking Maple Street, as if she might catch a glimpse of James's black car gliding by, even though she knew it was hours before his usual arrival time. "Miriam!" "Earth to Miriam!" Debbie's voice, tinged with gentle amusement, broke through her reverie. "You've been awfully quiet today. Is everything all right?" Miriam blinked, turning her attention back to the group. Besides Debbie, there was Tom, a retired postal worker with a penchant for bad jokes, Lisa, a young mother of two who always seemed to radiate calm despite her hectic life, and a few other regulars from the book club. "Oh, I'm fine, dear," Miriam said, forcing a smile. "Just a bit distracted, I suppose." "Distracted by what?" Tom chimed in, leaning forward with interest. "You've got that look you used to get when you were planning one of your famous neighborhood watch campaigns." A chuckle rippled through the group at the memory of Miriam's passionate crusades against everything from unleashed dogs to improperly sorted recycling. But Miriam didn't laugh. Instead, she set down her teacup, a determined look settling over her features. "Actually," she began, her voice low but steady, "there is something that's been bothering me. I'm not sure if any of you have noticed, but we've had some unusual activity in the neighborhood lately." The group leaned in, curiosity piqued. Miriam took a deep breath, knowing that once she started, there would be no going back. "It's about James Harlow," she said, watching as recognition flickered across their faces. "You know, the wealthy businessman who used to live in that big mansion on the hill? Well, he's been coming to our neighborhood every night for the past few months." "James Harlow," Lisa repeated, her brow furrowing. I thought I saw him driving down our street the other day. But what's so unusual about that? He's always been involved in the community, hasn't he? Miriam nodded, her fingers tapping nervously against her teacup. Yes, but this is different. He's not just driving through or making charitable visits. He's been staying in that old abandoned garage at the end of Maple Street. Every night. A moment of stunned silence fell over the group. Tom was the first to break it, letting out a low whistle. Now that is strange. What would a man like James Harlow be doing in a place like that? That's not all, Miriam continued, lowering her voice further. He's not alone. There's a little girl with him. Every night they drive up in his fancy car, go into the garage, and don't come out until early the next morning. The reaction from the group was immediate and varied. Debbie's eyes widened in surprise, while Tom let out another low whistle. Lisa looked thoughtful, her brow furrowed in concentration. A little girl, Debbie echoed, her voice a mix of concern and curiosity. How old? I'd say no more than 7 or 8, Miriam replied. She always wears a bright yellow dress, pretty little thing with dark curly hair. And you're sure they're staying there overnight? Tom asked, his usual joviality replaced by a serious expression. Miriam nodded emphatically. Positive. I've seen them go in at night and come out in the morning. They never interact with anyone else. It's like they're hiding. A heavy silence fell over the group as they digested this information. Miriam could almost see the gears turning in their minds, and she braced herself for their reactions. Well, Lisa said slowly, breaking the silence, it does sound unusual, but James has always been known for his charitable work. Maybe he's helping the girl's family somehow. Debbie nodded in agreement. That's right. Remember when he helped the Johnsons keep their house after Mr. Johnson lost his job? James has always been generous with those less fortunate. But in an abandoned garage, Miriam pressed, frustration creeping into her voice. With a child? Don't you think that's a bit suspicious? Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Now, Miriam, let's not jump to conclusions. We all know James has always been a stand-up guy. He's helped this community a lot. Why are you making it sound like he's done something wrong? Miriam felt a flicker of doubt at Tom's words, but the memory of Amara's shadowed eyes steeled her resolve. I'm not accusing him of anything, she said defensively. I'm just saying it's strange. Don't you think we have a responsibility to make sure everything is all right, especially where a child is concerned? An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Miriam could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the reluctance to get involved in something that might turn out to be nothing. Miriam, Debbie said gently, reaching out to pat her hand, I know you mean well, but maybe you're reading too much into this. Is it possible that you're looking for something to focus on since... She trailed off, but Miriam knew what she was implying. Since her husband died. This has nothing to do with that, Miriam said firmly, pulling her hand away. I know what I've seen. Something isn't right, and I thought you all would want to know. Lisa leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. Miriam, I understand you're concerned, but we have to be careful about making assumptions. James has always been good to this community. And the girl, well, is it because she's black? Are you assuming something sinister just because of who she is? Miriam recoiled as if she'd been slapped. Of course not, she exclaimed, her voice rising. This has nothing to do with race. I'm worried about a child who might be in trouble. All right, Tom interjected, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. Let's all calm down. Miriam, we hear your concerns, but don't you think it might be a bit, well, invasive to pry into James's private business? Rich folks can be eccentric, you know. Maybe it's just some personal matter he doesn't want to broadcast. Miriam looked around the table, her heart sinking as she saw the skepticism and discomfort on her friends' faces. She had hoped for support, for others to share her concern. Instead, she felt increasingly isolated, her worries dismissed or worse, attributed to prejudice or loneliness. I suppose you might be right, she said finally, her voice small. Perhaps I am overreacting. Debbie reached out again, this time successfully patting Miriam's hand. "It's okay to be concerned, dear, but let's not go making mountains out of molehills. I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything." The conversation gradually shifted to other topics: the upcoming fall festival, Lisa's daughter's dance recital, the new restaurant opening downtown. But Miriam barely heard any of it. She sat quietly, nursing her now cold tea, feeling more alone than ever. As the meeting began to break up, with people gathering their things and saying their goodbyes, Miriam remained seated. She watched as her neighbors filed out, their laughter and chatter a stark contrast to the turmoil in her mind. Lisa was the last to leave, pausing by Miriam's chair. "Are you coming, Miriam?" she asked gently. Miriam forced a smile. "In a minute, dear, you go on ahead." As the door closed behind Lisa, leaving Miriam alone in the suddenly quiet community center, she felt a resolve hardening within her. Her neighbors might not believe her, might think her paranoid or even prejudiced, but she knew what she had seen. Something was wrong, and if no one else was going to do anything about it, then it was up to her. With a determined set to her shoulders, Miriam gathered her things and headed for the door. As she stepped out into the crisp autumn air, she knew that her vigilance would only increase. James Harlow and the mysterious little girl in the yellow dress may have fooled everyone else, but Miriam Watson was not so easily deterred. She would get to the bottom of this mystery, no matter what anyone else thought. The days following the community center conversation passed in a blur for Miriam. The crisp autumn air carried with it a chill that seemed to seep into her bones, mirroring the cold isolation she felt growing within her. As she went about her daily routines, tending to her small garden, preparing her solitary meals, watching her favorite evening programs, she found her mind constantly drifting back to James and Amara. Her neighbor's dismissal of her concerns had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She caught herself second-guessing her observations, wondering if perhaps she had indeed been making mountains out of molehills, as Debbie had suggested. But then night would fall, and like clockwork, James's car would glide down the street, disappearing into the old garage with Amara in tow. Miriam's vigil at her living room window became more intense. She found herself spending hours perched on her favorite armchair, curtains slightly parted, eyes fixed on the dilapidated structure at the end of the street. She began to notice small details she had overlooked before, how James's shoulders seemed to slump slightly as he exited the car, the way Amara's steps dragged just a little as they approached the garage door. One particularly chilly evening, as Miriam watched James and Amara make their nightly entrance, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. James's once immaculate blue suit looked slightly rumpled, as if it hadn't been pressed in days, and Amara's bright yellow dress, which had always been a cheerful beacon in the gathering dusk, seemed duller somehow, the fabric showing signs of wear. "This isn't right," Miriam muttered to herself, her fingers worrying at the edge of her cardigan. "Something's changed. Something's wrong." But who could she tell? Her neighbors had made it clear that they thought she was overreacting. The memory of their skeptical faces at the community center still stung. Miriam could almost hear their voices in her head. "Rich people can be eccentric," Tom had said. "Is it because the girl is black?" Lisa had asked, her implication cutting deep. Miriam shook her head vigorously, trying to dispel the doubts that crept in. No, she wasn't imagining things, and she certainly wasn't motivated by any kind of prejudice. What she was seeing was real, and her instincts told her it wasn't right. As the days wore on, Miriam found herself becoming more and more isolated. Her usual routines, the book club meetings, afternoon teas with Debbie, even her weekly trips to the local grocery store, began to feel strained. She could sense the sidelong glances, the whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she approached. It was clear that word of her obsession with James and Amara had spread through the neighborhood grapevine. One afternoon, as Miriam was tending to her front garden, she overheard a conversation between two passing neighbors. "There she is again," one whispered, not quite softly enough. "Always watching. It's not healthy, you know." "I heard she's convinced that nice Mr. Harlow is up to something sinister," the other replied. "Can you imagine? After all he's done for this community?" Miriam's cheeks burned with embarrassment and frustration. She wanted to stand up, to confront them, to make them understand. But what could she say? That she'd seen James's suit looking wrinkled, that Amara's dress seemed a little worn? It all sounded so trivial when she thought about saying it out loud. Instead, she ducked her head and continued pruning her roses, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. The isolation was beginning to wear on her, but it also strengthened her resolve. If no one else would see what was happening, then it was up to her to uncover the truth. As autumn deepened, Miriam's anxiety grew alongside her determination. She began to lose sleep, spending long hours into the night watching the garage, straining to catch any sound or movement that might provide a clue. Dark circles formed under her eyes and she lost weight as her appetite waned. One particularly restless night, Miriam found herself pacing her living room, her mind racing. The more she thought about the situation, the more convinced she became that something truly sinister was afoot. Why else would a wealthy man and a young girl be hiding in an abandoned garage? Why the secrecy, the isolation? As she paced, a memory surfaced, a news story from years ago about a child trafficking ring that had been uncovered in a nearby city. The details had been horrific, the images haunting. Miriam felt her heart rate quicken as her imagination began to run wild. Could it be possible? Could James Harlow, the once respected businessman, be involved in something so terrible? The thought made her feel ill, but it also galvanized her. If there was even the slightest chance that Amara was in danger, Miriam couldn't stand by and do nothing. But what could she do? The police? Would they listen to her? An elderly woman with no real evidence beyond her own observations? Her neighbors certainly hadn't. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over Brookvale, Miriam made a decision. She would have to take matters into her own hands. She would follow James, gather evidence, and then, when she had something concrete, she would make sure someone listened. The next evening, as James's car pulled out of the garage right on schedule, Miriam was ready. She had her coat on and her keys in hand. As soon as the garage door closed behind James and Amara, Miriam slipped out of her house and into her old sedan. Her heart pounded as she started the engine, feeling like a character in one of the mystery novels she so enjoyed. For several nights, Miriam followed James and Amara when they left the garage. Her hands shook on the steering wheel as she trailed them at a distance, always careful not to be spotted. Most nights their routine seemed maddeningly mundane. They would drive to a nearby park, sit on a bench for a while, sometimes getting ice cream from a local shop before returning to the garage. What struck Miriam most during these outings was the strange dynamic between James and Amara. They rarely spoke, and when they did, it seemed strained, awkward. Amara often looked sad or distant, while James appeared perpetually tense, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings as if expecting danger. One night, as Miriam watched them from her car parked across the street from the park, she saw something that chilled her to the bone. James and Amara were sitting on their usual bench, the little girl's legs swinging listlessly as James stared off into the distance. Suddenly, James's head snapped up, his body tensing. He quickly stood, taking Amara's hand and hurrying her back to the car. Miriam's heart raced as she watched them drive away, their departure more rushed than usual. What had spooked James? What was he running from? The questions swirled in her mind, adding to the growing list of mysteries surrounding the pair. As she drove home that night, following James and Amara back to the garage, Miriam felt a mix of emotions swirling within her. Fear, certainly. Fear for Amara, fear of what she might uncover, fear of being wrong and making a fool of herself, but also a grim determination. She was in too deep now to back out. Whatever the truth was, she would find it. Back in her house, Miriam sat by her window watching as the lights in the garage eventually went out. She thought about Amara, imagining the young girl trying to sleep in that cold, damp space. What kind of life was that for a child? Whatever James Harlow's reasons, whatever he was involved in, surely Amara deserved better. As she finally prepared for bed in the early hours of the morning, Miriam made a silent promise. To herself, to Amara, even to James. She would get to the bottom of this mystery, no matter the cost. Little did she know how soon that promise would be put to the test, or how it would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone in Brookvale. The air had turned decidedly crisp as October gave way to November. The trees lining Maple Street, once a riot of reds and golds, were now mostly bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward a steel-grey sky. Miriam pulled her cardigan tighter around herself as she settled into her usual spot by the window, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. Her vigilance had become a nightly ritual, as regular as James and Amara's arrivals at the garage. But tonight felt different somehow. There was a tension in the air, a sense of anticipation that Miriam couldn't quite shake. As the streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows across the pavement, Miriam's attention was drawn to an unfamiliar sight. A sleek, black luxury car, its polished surface gleaming even in the dim light, glided down the street. It moved with purpose, slowing as it approached the abandoned garage. Miriam leaned forward, her nose almost pressing against the cold glass of her window. This was new. In all the months she'd been watching, she'd never seen anyone else visit the garage. Her heart began to race as she took in the details of the car. It was far too luxurious for their modest neighborhood. The car came to a stop directly in front of the garage. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. Even from a distance, Miriam could tell he was the epitome of wealth and power. His suit, dark and impeccably tailored, spoke of boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations. He moved with the confidence of someone used to being in control. As if on cue, the garage door began to creak open. James emerged, his own once sharp suit now noticeably rumpled. The contrast between the two men was stark, and Miriam felt a pang of sympathy for James despite her suspicions. The visitor spoke first, his voice too low for Miriam to hear, but his body language was clear. He was agitated, gesturing emphatically as he spoke. James, for his part, seemed to be trying to calm the man down. His posture was defensive, his hands held up in a placating gesture. Their conversation lasted only a few minutes, but to Miriam it felt like hours. She strained to hear even a snippet of their exchange, but the words were lost to the distance and the whisper of wind through the bare trees. Finally, the visitor seemed to have said his piece. He thrust a finger in James's face, the gesture unmistakably threatening, before turning on his heel and striding back to his car. The engine roared to life and the vehicle sped away, leaving James standing alone in front of the garage. Miriam watched, her breath fogging the window, as James remained motionless for several long moments. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed. He looked, Miriam thought, like a man carrying the weight of the world. Then slowly James turned and walked back into the garage. The door creaked shut behind him, and silence once again settled over Maple Street. Miriam sat back in her chair, her mind whirling. What had she just witnessed? Who was that man, and what did he want with James? The encounter had been brief but intense, and it was clear that whatever was going on, it was serious. As she replayed the scene in her mind, Miriam felt her suspicions crystallizing into something more concrete. This wasn't just about a man and a little girl living in strange circumstances. There was something bigger at play here, something potentially dangerous. The rest of the night passed in a blur of racing thoughts and half-formed theories. Miriam barely slept, her dreams when they came filled with shadowy figures and muffled conversations. She woke the next morning feeling more exhausted than when she'd gone to bed, but also more determined than ever. As she went through her morning routine, making her bed, brewing a pot of strong coffee, picking at a piece of toast she had no appetite for, Miriam tried to piece together everything she knew. James Harlow, once a wealthy and respected businessman, now living in an abandoned garage with a young girl. The mysterious nighttime visitor, clearly angry about something. The tense encounters in the park, the constant vigilance, the air of secrecy that surrounded everything James did. It all added up to something, but what? Miriam couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, some key fact that would make everything clear. As she washed her breakfast dishes, staring out at the quiet street beyond her kitchen window, Miriam made a decision. She had been watching from afar for too long. If she wanted answers, real answers, she would need to take a more active approach. The thought sent a shiver of fear through her. What if she was wrong? What if, as her neighbors suggested, she was just a lonely old woman imagining conspiracies where none existed? Or worse, what if she was right and by interfering she put herself or Amara in danger? But then she thought of Amara's sad eyes, of James's slumped shoulders, of the threatening gesture of the mysterious visitor. Whatever was happening, it wasn't right. And if no one else was going to do anything about it, then it fell to her. Miriam dried her hands on a dish towel, her resolve hardening. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do yet, but she knew she had to do something. As she looked out at the garage, silent and innocuous in the pale morning light, she made a silent vow. "I'm going to find out the truth," she whispered to herself, "for Amara's sake, and for James's too, whatever it takes." Little did Miriam know that her chance to uncover the truth would come sooner than she expected, and in a way she could never have anticipated. The events set in motion by the mysterious visitor's appearance were about to come to a head, and Miriam would find herself at the center of a revelation that would shake Brookvale to its core. The days following the mysterious visitor's appearance passed in a haze of heightened vigilance for Miriam. Her nightly observations took on a new intensity, her eyes straining in the darkness for any sign of further unusual activity around the garage. But nights came and went without incident, the routine of James and Amara's arrivals and departures as regular as clockwork. Yet something had changed. Miriam could sense it in the air, a tension that seemed to radiate from the old garage at the end of the street. She noticed it in the way James's movements seemed more hurried, his glances over his shoulder more frequent. Even Amara, usually stoic and quiet, seemed to have picked up on the shift. Her small hand clung tighter to James's as they made their way from car to garage each evening. Driven by a mix of concern and an almost obsessive need to uncover the truth, Miriam decided to take her surveillance a step further. On a particularly cold November evening, she bundled up in her warmest coat, pulled on a pair of sturdy walking shoes, and set out to follow James and Amara on foot. Her heart pounded as she slipped out of her house, staying close to the shadows cast by the bare trees lining the street. She felt equal parts ridiculous and exhilarated, a 72-year-old woman playing at being a detective. But the memory of the mysterious visitor's threatening gesture steeled her resolve. As James's car pulled out of the garage, Miriam hurried to follow, keeping to the sidewalk and trying her best to look like nothing more than an old woman out for an evening stroll. She tracked them to the local park, the same one she'd observed them visiting before. From behind a large oak tree, Miriam watched as James and Amara settled onto a bench. The park was nearly deserted at this hour, the play equipment standing silent and ghostly in the glow of the streetlights. James and Amara sat in what appeared to be uncomfortable silence, neither speaking nor making eye contact. Miriam strained to hear any conversation, but the only sounds were the rustle of dead leaves in the chilly breeze and the distant hum of traffic. As she watched, she noticed something that made her heart clench. Amara, her bright yellow dress now visibly worn and slightly too small, was shivering in the cold night air. Without a word, James shrugged off his suit jacket, the same one he'd been wearing for months now, Miriam realized, and draped it over Amara's small shoulders. The gesture was so tender, so paternal, that for a moment Miriam felt a pang of doubt about her suspicions. Could she have misjudged the situation so badly? But then she remembered the mysterious visitor, the heated exchange, the fear she'd seen in James's eyes. No, there was definitely more to this story than met the eye. As if to confirm her thoughts, the silence between James and Amara was suddenly broken. Miriam couldn't make out the words, but Amara's voice rose in what sounded like distress. James responded, his tone low and urgent. Miriam inched closer, desperate to hear what was being said. "Can't keep doing this, Amara," James's voice drifted to her on the wind. It's not safe anymore." Amara's response was too quiet for Miriam to catch, but she saw the little girl shake her head vigorously, her small hands clutching at James's arm. "I know, sweetheart," James said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know it's hard, but we might not have a choice." The conversation lapsed back into murmurs too low for Miriam to hear. Her mind raced. What wasn't safe? What choice were they facing? The snippets she'd overheard only deepened the mystery. Lost in thought, Miriam didn't notice the twig beneath her foot until it was too late. The snap seemed to echo through the quiet park like a gunshot. James's head whipped around, his eyes scanning the darkness, and Miriam's heart leapt into her throat. She pressed herself against the tree trunk, hardly daring to breathe. For a long, tense moment, James stared in her direction. Then, abruptly, he stood, taking Amara's hand. "Come on," she heard him say, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "We need to go, now." Miriam watched, her pulse racing, as James hurried Amara out of the park. She waited until they were out of sight before sagging against the tree, her legs suddenly weak. The encounter had left her shaken, but more certain than ever that something was terribly wrong. As she made her way home, moving as quickly as her aging legs would allow, Miriam's mind was in turmoil. The snippets of conversation she'd overheard played on repeat in her head. It's not safe anymore. We might not have a choice. What did it all mean? By the time she reached her house, Miriam was breathless and trembling, as much from the emotional weight of what she'd witnessed as from the physical exertion. She sank into her favorite armchair, her eyes automatically seeking out the garage at the end of the street. It stood silent and dark, offering no answers to the questions swirling in her mind. Sleep eluded Miriam that night. She tossed and turned, her dreams when they came filled with shadowy figures and muffled voices. She woke the next morning feeling drained, but more determined than ever to get to the bottom of the mystery. As the days wore on, Miriam's anxiety grew alongside her determination. She found herself jumping at small noises, her nerves frayed by the constant state of vigilance. Her neighbors, already wary of her obsession with James and Amara, began to avoid her altogether. But Miriam hardly noticed, her focus entirely consumed by the goings-on at the end of the street. One evening, about a week after her covert trip to the park, Miriam was jolted from her vigil by a sound she'd never heard before, raised voices coming from the direction of the garage. Her heart racing, she pressed her face to the window, straining to see through the gathering dusk. The garage door was partially open, a slice of yellow light spilling out onto the street. And there, clearly visible in that shaft of light, were James and Amara. Even from a distance, Miriam could see that Amara was crying, her small body shaking with sobs. James was kneeling in front of her, his hands on her shoulders, speaking urgently. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. This was the most emotion, the most interaction she'd ever seen between the two. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. She had to get closer, had to hear what was being said. As she crept down the street, keeping to the shadows as much as possible, the voices became clearer. Amara's sobs were punctuated by words Miriam couldn't quite make out, but the distress in her voice was unmistakable. James's tone was a mix of frustration and desperation. "We can't stay here anymore, Amara," she heard him say as she drew closer. "It's not safe, they know where we are." "But I don't want to leave," Amara wailed. "This is our home now. Why can't we just stay?" James's reply was too low for Miriam to hear, but whatever he said seemed to upset Amara even more. Her cries grew louder, echoing in the quiet street. Miriam's heart was pounding so hard she was sure they must be able to hear it. She was close now, closer than she'd ever been to the garage. Part of her screamed to turn back, to mind her own business. But a stronger part, the part that had been watching and worrying for months, urged her forward. She was so focused on James and Amara, so intent on hearing their conversation, that she didn't notice the loose paving stone until it was too late. Her foot caught and she stumbled, letting out a startled yelp as she fought to regain her balance. The effect was instantaneous. The voices from the garage cut off abruptly. Miriam looked up, her heart in her throat, to see James standing in the doorway, his expression a mix of fear and anger. For a long moment they stared at each other, the silence broken only by Amara's muffled sobs from inside the garage. Miriam opened her mouth, though she had no idea what she was going to say. But before she could utter a word, James's expression hardened. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You're the one who's been watching us." Miriam felt a chill run down her spine at his tone. This was not the James Harlow she remembered, the generous businessman who had helped so many in the community. This was a man pushed to the edge, a man with nothing left to lose. I was just concerned," Miriam stammered, taking a step back. "The little girl, I thought—" "You thought what?" James demanded, taking a step towards her. "That you'd play detective? That you'd uncover some big secret?" Miriam's mouth went dry. She had imagined this confrontation so many times, had rehearsed what she would say. But now, faced with James's anger and her own fear, all her carefully prepared words deserted her. "I'm sorry," she managed to say. "I didn't mean to. I was just worried about the child." At the mention of Amara, something in James's expression changed. The anger drained away, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that made him look far older than his years. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "No idea at all." Before Miriam could respond, a car turned onto the street, its headlights cutting through the darkness. James's head whipped around, his body tensing like a cornered animal. "Go home," he said to Miriam, his voice urgent. "Go home and forget what you've seen. For your own sake and for Amara's." With that, he retreated into the garage, the door sliding shut behind him with a decisive thud. Miriam stood frozen for a moment, her mind reeling. The approaching car slowed as it neared her, and she suddenly became aware of how suspicious she must look, an old woman standing alone in the street at night. Gathering her wits, Miriam turned and hurried back to her house as quickly as she could. Once inside, she leaned against the door, her heart pounding. The confrontation had left her shaken, but it had also confirmed her worst fears. Whatever was going on with James and Amara, it was serious, possibly dangerous. As she made her way to her bedroom, Miriam's mind was made up. Tomorrow she would go to the police. She had to tell someone what she had seen and heard. For Amara's sake, and for James's too, she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. Little did Miriam know that events were already in motion that would bring the truth to light, in a way she could never have anticipated. As she drifted into an uneasy sleep, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would change everything. The morning dawned grey and cold, a fine mist hanging in the air like a veil. Miriam woke early, her sleep having been fitful and plagued by unsettling dreams. The events of the previous night weighed heavily on her mind as she went through her morning routine, her movements mechanical as she prepared a breakfast she had no appetite for. As she sipped her tea, staring out at the quiet street, Miriam's resolve hardened. She would go to the police station as soon as it opened. She would tell them everything she had seen and heard over the past months. Surely they would listen, would investigate. It was out of her hands now. But as she rinsed her cup in the sink, a movement outside caught her eye. James's car was pulling out of the garage, much earlier than usual. Miriam frowned, pressing closer to the window. Something was different. The car moved slowly, almost hesitantly, as if its driver was unsure of where to go. Without thinking, Miriam grabbed her coat and keys. She couldn't let them leave, not before she had a chance to talk to the police. She had to do something, anything, to keep them here until she could get help. Her heart pounding, Miriam hurried out of her house and down the street. James's car had barely reached the end of the block, moving at a crawl. As she drew closer, she could see James behind the wheel, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. Beside him, Amara's small face was just visible, her eyes wide with fear. "Wait," Miriam called out, her voice cracking. "Please wait." James's head snapped around at the sound of her voice. For a moment, Miriam saw naked panic in his eyes. Then, to her surprise, the car slowed to a stop. James sat there for a long moment, His shoulders slumped in defeat. Then slowly he opened the door and stepped out. "Mrs. Watson," he said, his voice weary, "I thought I told you to stay out of this." Miriam approached cautiously, her hands held up in a placating gesture. "Mr. Harlow." "James," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, "I know you think you're protecting Amara, but this isn't right. Living in that garage, always hiding, it's no life for a child." James's face contorted with a mix of anger and despair. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and intense. "You have no idea what's really going on here." "Then tell me," Miriam pleaded. "Help me understand. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're in some kind of trouble, and that little girl is caught in the middle of it." For a long moment, James said nothing. He stood there, the morning mist swirling around him, looking more lost and alone than Miriam had ever seen anyone look. Then, almost imperceptibly, something in him seemed to break. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We are in trouble. But it's not what you think." Miriam took a step closer, her heart racing. "What is it then?" she asked gently. "Please, James, let me help." James looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing his options. Then, with a deep sigh, he began to speak. "I used to be wealthy," he said, his eyes distant. "I had it all, the mansion, the cars, the successful business. But then things changed. The market crashed, bad investments, a string of poor decisions. I lost everything." Miriam listened, her eyes wide. This was not at all what she had expected. "I couldn't bear the shame," James continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The thought of everyone knowing, of seeing the pity in their eyes. So I ran. I took Amara and what little money I had left, and we disappeared." "But why here?" Miriam asked, gesturing to the garage. "Why live like this?" James's face contorted with a mix of despair and resignation. "Where else could we go? I had no money for rent, no job prospects. This garage, it was the only place I could think of where we might be safe, where we could stay hidden until I figured out what to do next." Miriam's mind reeled as she tried to process this information, all her suspicions, all her fears about sinister activities, and it had all been so much simpler, and in some ways so much sadder than she had imagined. "But the man who visited," she said, remembering the tense encounter she had witnessed. "Who was he?" James's face darkened. "A creditor," he said bitterly. "One of many. They've been searching for me, demanding money I don't have. That's why we have to leave. They've found us, and it's not safe here anymore." Miriam felt a wave of compassion wash over her. She looked past James to the car, where Amara sat watching them with wide, frightened eyes. The little girl who had been at the center of all her concerns, who she had worried was in danger. In a way, she had been right, but not in the way she had imagined. "Oh, James," she said softly, "why didn't you ask for help? There are people here who would have understood." James shook his head, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I couldn't," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "I was too proud, too ashamed, and now it's too late." Miriam's mind raced. She thought of her comfortable home standing empty for most of the day. She thought of the community that James had once been such an important part of, even if they didn't know his current situation. "It's not too late," she said firmly. "James, listen to me. You don't have to run anymore. Let me help you." James looked at her, hope and doubt warring in his eyes. "How?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. Miriam straightened her shoulders, feeling more sure of herself than she had in months. "First," she said, "you and Amara are coming to stay with me. No arguments. We'll figure out how to handle these creditors, how to get you back on your feet, and we'll do it discreetly." James stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and desperate hope. "You'd do that for us?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Even after all this?" Miriam nodded firmly. "Sometimes," she said, "we find family in the most unexpected places. Now come on, let's get you and Amara settled. We have a lot of work to do, but we'll do it together." James hesitated for just a moment before nodding. As they walked back towards Miriam's house, with Amara trailing behind them, Miriam felt a sense of purpose settle over her. The mystery was solved, but in many ways their journey was just beginning. The walk back to Miriam's house was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the front door, Miriam noticed James's hesitation, the way his steps slowed, as if the reality of their situation was only now truly sinking in. "It's all right," Miriam said softly, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "You're safe here." James nodded, swallowing hard. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As Miriam opened the door, ushering them into the warmth of her home, she couldn't help but marvel at how quickly life could change. Just this morning, she had been consumed by suspicion and fear. Now, she was opening her home to the very people she had been watching from afar for so long. As Miriam showed James and Amara to the spare bedroom, the weight of their new arrangement hung heavy in the air. Once Amara was settled, James gently asked her to unpack while he spoke with Miriam. They retreated to the kitchen, where James's expression grew serious. "Miriam," he began, his voice low, "I can't thank you enough for your help. There's something important I need to ask you, though." Miriam nodded, sensing his unease. "Of course, James, what is it?" James glanced towards the bedroom to ensure Amara couldn't overhear. "I'd appreciate it if we could keep our situation private for now. The debt collectors, I'd rather they didn't know exactly where we are. It's not dangerous, but I'd like to keep a low profile while I sort things out." Miriam's brow furrowed slightly. "I understand, James. Is there anything else I should be aware of?" He shook his head. "No, it's just about giving us some breathing room. Can you help us with this, Miriam? At least until we get back on our feet." Miriam gave him a reassuring smile. "Of course, James, your privacy is safe with me." Relief softened James's features. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It means more than you know." As days passed, the small family settled into a quiet routine, their presence filling Miriam's once solitary home with new life. James moved through the house with a mix of gratitude and lingering worry, the weight of his recent past still evident in his demeanor. Miriam often found him on the back porch, lost in thought as he gazed at the horizon. During one such evening, Miriam joined him, offering a steaming mug of tea. She settled into the chair beside him, allowing a comfortable silence to stretch between them before speaking. "The sunset seems to have you deep in thought," she observed softly. "Mind sharing what's on your mind?" James's fingers traced the rim of the mug as he spoke, his voice soft. "I keep thinking about how different things might have been if I'd faced my problems head-on instead of running." Miriam nodded, her eyes understanding. "We all make mistakes, James. What matters is how we learn from them. You're taking steps in the right direction now." She paused, then added warmly, "You know, I remember all the good you've done for this community over the years. Your charitable work, the people you've helped. Offering you a safe place now, it's the least I could do." A small smile tugged at the corners of James's mouth, tinged with both gratitude and regret. "I never thought I'd be on the receiving end of charity, but I'm grateful for your kindness, Miriam, and your discretion." Miriam chuckled softly. "Well, every neighborhood needs someone keeping an eye out, I suppose, even if it's to help those who've always been the helpers." As twilight deepened, Miriam felt a sense of peace settle over her. The mystery was solved, but their journey was far from over. Challenges lay ahead: rebuilding James's life, ensuring Amara's well-being, dealing with financial issues. Yet for the first time in months there was a glimmer of hope. From inside, Amara's soft humming drifted out to them, a gentle reminder of the new life taking root in Miriam's home. As autumn arrived in Brookvale, James took his first steps toward rebuilding his life. Through one of Miriam's old contacts, he secured a modest office job in a neighboring town. The position, handling general administrative tasks, was a far cry from his former executive role, but James approached it with quiet determination. After his first week, James shared his thoughts with Miriam. "It's an adjustment," he admitted, "but it's a start, something to build on." Miriam nodded encouragingly. Every journey begins with a single step, James. You're on the right path. When his first paycheck arrived, James insisted on contributing to the household expenses. Miriam initially refused, but James was adamant. "Please, Miriam," he explained, his voice sincere. "It's not just about the money. It's about regaining my self-respect, about being responsible again." Understanding the importance of this to James, Miriam agreed to accept a small amount for rent. When James handed her the money, the sense of accomplishment in his eyes touched Miriam deeply. Amara's enrollment in the local school marked another milestone. Her initial shyness soon gave way to excitement as she made new friends and embraced her studies. As the seasons changed, so did the household dynamic. James, encouraged by his new job and Amara's adjustment, began to address his outstanding debts. Miriam offered guidance, helping him create a budget and develop a repayment plan. The process was often challenging, but James remained committed. Their discretion was tested when a persistent debt collector called Miriam's home, asking about James. Miriam, drawing on an inner strength she didn't know she possessed, calmly handled the situation. Without revealing James's presence, she redirected the caller to the lawyer handling James's case. Her composed manner was enough to deter further inquiries for the time being. One evening, as they enjoyed their customary after-dinner tea on the porch, James turned to Miriam, his expression earnest. "I'm not sure I'll ever be able to fully repay you for all you've done," he said softly, "but I want you to know how grateful I am." Miriam reached out, patting his hand gently. "James," she replied warmly, "seeing you and Amara finding your feet again, that's all the thanks I need." As the first hints of winter appeared in Brookvale, Miriam reflected on the journey they had undertaken. The garage at the end of Maple Street stood empty, a reminder of darker days. But now it represented the beginning of a new chapter, a story of second chances and the power of compassion. In the warmth of her home, surrounded by the unexpected family she had found, Miriam realized that the greatest discovery wasn't about uncovering secrets. It was about the capacity of the human spirit to heal, to hope, and to find connection in the most unexpected of places. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the streets of Brookvale. What would you do if you saw a wealthy man and a young girl in a worn yellow dress sneaking into an abandoned garage every night? Would you have the courage to confront them directly, risking your safety and potentially making a terrible mistake? Share your thoughts in the comments, I would love to know. And if this story touched you as much as it did us, I've carefully selected another tale for you that I know you'll love. Please don't miss it. Click here to watch it now.